Welcome to a special Navigating Net Zero mini-series. Navigating Net Zero in Focus, Developments in Climate Standards and Guidance. In this mini-series, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with the leadership of many of the foremost climate accounting and reporting bodies to get the latest on this fast-moving, sometimes confusing space. Together, they get to the bottom of what each of these standards does, what they're doing to rise to the moment, and why it's so important to get all of this right. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next on our global transition to net zero. I'm your host, Alexia Kelly, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Dominic Waughray. Dominic is Executive Vice President of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where he leads the organization's work on climate, nature, and equity. He also serves as the Executive Co-Chair of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, helping to guide the evolution and governance of the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standards. Before joining WBCSD, Dominic spent more than 15 years as the Managing Director and member of the Managing Board at the World Economic Forum, where he helped launch some of the most influential sustainability initiatives and partnerships in the business. During this time, Dominic helped catalyze and build a significant program of public-private sustainability collaboration, including the Tropical Forest Alliance, Friends of Ocean Action, Nature Action Agenda, 1T.org, Climate Leaders Alliance, and the Mission Possible Partnership. He raised over $60 million in philanthropic and government support to support this work and is a well-recognized and frequent speaker and member of the circuit we all participate in. Dominic, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, it's very generous of you with that introduction, Alexia. It's a pleasure to be here. But, I think we're all in the same space. We all do what we can, right, across the various platforms and networks that we're in. So I'm sure there's amazing things that many of the listeners have done as well. And it's just a delight to be with you for a few minutes.
Well, thanks so much. And we're going to talk about a frequent topic. I think, as you know, we're having a series of conversations as part of a mini-series we're doing.
I can guess what you might zero in on from that list.
Let's talk about greenhouse gas accounting.
Yes, let's talk about greenhouse gas accounting. Who doesn't want to talk about that, Alexia?
I always joke that I am in this job for some sin that I committed in a past life, because I've spent nearly 20 years fighting over greenhouse gas accounting rules in a variety of roles, and the continued unfolding of the depth and the complexity and the importance of this space just never ceases to amaze me. And your work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, I think, has been really central to the nonprofit role in helping to develop new standards and to really make sure that civil society and business voices and interests are balanced and really brought into the decision-making process. So tell me a little bit about WBCSD and the work that you do there and the role it plays in the market today.
Yeah, sure. Appreciate that, Alexia. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, it's a not-for-profit business membership model. There's a membership criteria. So you have to be committed to, key elements of the transition that meet scientific and general policy aspirations, for example, on the climate transition. We have about 230 international companies who are members, representing about $11.6 trillion in corporate revenue. It's about a quarter of the global corporate marketplace. And about 15 gigatons in emissions, which again, depends how you count these things, but maybe about a quarter of the global greenhouse gas emissions. All of those companies have got kind of trajectories for the targets and reductions and things. But the point is, it's a significant marketplace of both revenue and in terms of tipping point, if you like, on the emission reduction pathway. What's interesting and why it's an attractive and exciting place to be is that these companies are multi-sector and multi-geography. So Europe, US, Asia, Japan, China, and end-to-end across the value chain, which is a really cool thing because you'll have upstream players, perhaps in the energy or, electrification business. You'll have midstream players who are producing goods and relying on those upstream suppliers. And you'll have downstream, FMCG and others who kind of want to create that demand signal along. And I don't really, in my experience, there's rarely a kind of a group like that with that scale, which is in one kind of organizational element, which means that you can really get to grips with working end to end along the value chain with a significant group of players to identify obstacles, opportunities where things work. And if you treat it like a platform, then all the cool things that people are doing on trying to stimulate green demand or trying to create investments upstream and, greener fertilizer or whatever it might be, you can start to bring these together because these companies, obviously, their technical people and their executives are working on many different things. And it's a great opportunity to say, okay, well, how does this click? And what levers or obstacles can we identify, levers to pull, obstacles to unblock that can really make things happen quicker? And of course, one of those is our dear old friend on the carbon accounting space, which makes it just a real privilege to, over these last 4.5 years where I've been at WBCSD, is to get into that carbon accounting piece, particularly through the greenhouse gas protocol. I wouldn't call myself like a lifelong expert in the space, but in a way, I hope that's actually a kind of an advantage because I find myself asking fairly dumb questions, which sometimes create quite revealing answers. And that's been a really interesting journey for me. Of course, we co-host the Greenhouse Gas Protocol with the World Resources Institute, and that's a 22-year, 23-year play. So there's been some amazing work, particularly by incredible people at WRI. Pankaj Bhatia stands out for me as someone who conceived and came up with this idea and really took it to another level. And there's some great people at WRI in the secretariat and the leadership team. I'm sure you'll be talking to some of them. One of the things that I've always intrigued about by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and not many people, I think, recognize this, is that originally, so imagine it's sort of 1990, kind of 95, 96, 97 or something, and it's kind of chaos in terms of people are realizing with Kyoto and all of that, that we need some way of getting business involved in the climate space. But there's literally no way that you organize how emissions are looked at or quantified or organized. And so into that kind of space, actually some companies said, look, here's how we do it. And what do you think, WBCSD and WRI? Is that a reasonable system? And that was back in the day, Dow Chemical, General Motors, and BP, the oil and gas company. And that's the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 framework. And they said, look, may or may not be useful, but try this out. And with all of the kind of science and expertise of WRI and others, that's where that Scopes framework came from. So it's an interesting kind of DNA in this agenda.
Yeah, it really is. And I know, especially now at a moment where it feels like there's a lot of tension and conversation around the role of nonprofit standard setters in this space, how they're interfacing with emerging regulatory regimes, and the level of access and participation that the private sector and the companies that these standards are seeking to influence should really have. And I think people don't always remember this, but at the beginning of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and to this day, really has always been a very active dialogue between the private sector companies and the civil society, academic, and nonprofit organizations, because that's how you end up with good rules.
Yeah.
And so maybe talk a little bit about that process and how you see that coming from WBCSD and how that interfaces with the standard setting process overall.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, Alexia. And the whole thing is a fascinating space, right? Because many of us, sometimes ourselves included, many of our kind of friends and colleagues and fellow travelers in this space are kind of often really try to search for clarity and precision. And if only there were a clear set of rules everyone followed and bang, 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 bang. If only everybody was heavily regulated, they'd do the right thing. Or if only there was so much flexibility but within a science-based approach. The challenge, I think, in today's world, and it's been coming for some time, there's a great quote by a former European Commission parliamentarian who said, we all know what to do, but we know we'd never get re-elected if we did it. So, it's very clear that there are kind of things that need to happen. The challenge is, how do you get a kind of spaghetti bowl of different stakeholders, scientists and civil society organizations and politicians and businesses, large and small, in different sectors and different political geometries and different perspectives on history and different power balances to kind of move in the same direction. You can see the same challenges in trade or in AI and kind of rules and kind of ethics around that. And this is exactly the same in this space. So we're not unique in the kind of carbon accounting space in terms of how we organize ourselves as human beings in a complex system. You could go back to the turn of the century, and the same thing happened when people were trying to figure out how you might get plugs in the wall and AC and DC electricity, or a little bit closer to home, how you have kind of universal rules for financial accounting. That took a lot of effort. But in the kind of greenhouse gas protocol, carbon accounting space, it's pretty interesting because we've been on a journey where through trial, error, adjustment, multi-stakeholder engagement through technical working groups of scientists who say this is where we need to be, business and financial folk who say, well, this is how pragmatically we could try that out and do it, and this is what works. Civil society saying, don't forget about the power balance here, or how will that information work for emerging economies, as well as all of that was a voluntary thing. Amazingly, what kind of people might call de facto. Nobody had to, but everybody kind of increasingly did, to the extent that about 97% of the S&P 500 and about 90% of the FTSE 1000 use these voluntary greenhouse gas protocol guidances and standards in Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And that's an incredible achievement. And there was never a big kind of international meeting where a bunch of whoever they might be decision makers, whether it was governments or business or others, said, this is what we should do. It kind of grew up. And it grew up because the more people tried it, the more people thought, yeah, that kind of works and helps me to present my case to others. And others, whoever they might be, said, yeah, I understand that. I can sort of see what you are presenting and how you are trying to get better compared to where you were. And now that we've got this kind of structure, I can compare apples to apples. I can look at different companies, or I can look this year compared to 3 years ago. And for the policymaking or business or regulatory community, that's complete gold dust, because it allows you to see what is emerging, what works, where it could be improved. But it's so much easier to build a kind of de jure, a regulation on top of something that many people have confidence in using than trying to come up with something from scratch. And that's really the arc, I think, of the greenhouse gas protocol, where it has been this sort of voluntary de facto thing in many places. And as I said, many companies are using it, like the vast majority. But I would say over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and that curve is getting increasingly steeper, it's flipping into more of a regulatory or more of a formal policy space. And there's been a couple of really interesting developments which have helped to spur that. In the US context, of course, California citing the greenhouse gas protocol in its climate law was quite a big deal. Internationally, there's something called the International Sustainability Standards Board. They use the acronym ISSB, and then the even cuter acronym S2 for the kind of carbon-related piece of their sustainability standards. And they're coming out of something called the IFRS Foundation, which is the sort of international organization for financial accounting and standards, led by a person called Emmanuel Faber, who interestingly used to be the CFO, then the CEO of Danone, the big food consumer goods company out of France, who kind of has a very strong feel for how these things work, and who was a big proponent of the greenhouse gas protocol when it was voluntary. The ISSB has created a set of standards, and they work very closely with governments. And they've got about 38 governments around the world who are on a journey of adopting those ISSB standards, including this S2 one for climate and greenhouse gas measurements. And that includes countries like China, fascinatingly related to their 5-year plan, their latest 15th 5-year plan. By the end of 2027, they're supposed to be on an alignment journey with ISSB, and many other key countries. Not the US, but the US always has a slightly different approach to these matters, but many other countries around the world. In fact, close to 60% or so of GDP might be covered by those 38 jurisdictions, and upward of 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I say all of that because for the greenhouse gas protocol, there's an alignment, a link with the ISSB. The greenhouse gas protocol is, let's call it the kind of carbon accounting mechanism of choice for the ISSB, which means that if you are, as a government, aligning with this ISSB guidance on how you organize and measure your climate accounts, you would be using the greenhouse gas protocol, like California has placed it into its legal requirement. And that's a fascinating journey from voluntary to increasingly mandatory. And the reason for that is because so many companies already use the greenhouse gas protocol, number one. Number two, because it's quite transparent, which regulators and standard setters really need. There's all of these technical working groups, all of the minutes and discussions are published externally. Everyone can have a big argument about everything, and as you know, many people do. But that's kind of part of the rough and tumble of the process. You cannot do this behind closed doors. You cannot do it in a kind of dictatorial, clean way. It has to be like that. And it gets to where it needs to get to through that process. So it's pretty interesting how a voluntary mechanism like this in the world where at the moment we're not really kind of providing great leadership as people who've been in this career for some time to younger folk about how we can create joined up international systems for our global public goods, if I can put it like that. This, I would posit, is a bit of a success story, despite all of the kind of bumps and grinds, about for a global public good like our climate and how desperately important it is to have a common way of measuring those emissions so people can compare things. We're not doing too badly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this iterative cycle that we have where the voluntary market will front run, develop a rule set, regulators will come in behind and adopt it. Doesn't always happen, but I think in this space, and particularly with respect to voluntary corporate action, that's been a really important dynamic in helping companies start to wrap their heads around, okay, how much do I emit? How much am I responsible for? And, how do I start then thinking about a plan? That old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure, is actually quite true.
Right. I'll tell you what, I mean, you must have, if there's people kind of watching or listening to this, and I know they do, I know how popular your podcast is, Alexia.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, no, trust me, if you're one of those people and you're working in a company and you're under carbon accounting or the kind of, the piece of the company where you're trying to figure it out, and you go to these meetings and you're struggling and you're looking at those technical advisory groups and you're putting in criticisms, you are part of that movement that has built this piece. So it's actually you and the work that you're doing that has got us to this kind of framework. It's so important with those pushes and pulls and challenges and letters and notes and adoptions, and that's exactly it.
Yep.
And I think it's terrific that as humans we can kind of wrestle with such a complicated problem, be able to push and pull and tear things and put it back together and slowly but significantly build a house for this. So it should feel like all of those contributions that everyone makes as part of that journey. And that is now recognized by those who have a mandate to turn it into kind of law, basically. And it's not insignificant. And, if someone were someday to kind of write a history of the most significant public, private, scientific, multi-stakeholder collaborations on networks, I would suggest that this would be one of them.
I think that's true. And I think we've really worked very hard. We need to hunt the good stuff, particularly for those of us living in the United States right now. And I think this focus on really that slow iterative improvement over time, and the fact now that the greenhouse gas protocol standard, which I remember when it first started, the very beginning of my career, how controversial it was that companies would even report. Wait, you want us to measure I don't want to tell you how much I emit, because if I tell you how much I emit, I might then be responsible for it or perceived to be responsible for it or held accountable for it. And so that fact that you noted, which is that now all companies report, it's just considered a given that you are in fact reporting your greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis, right? Which is a big deal. It is a heavy lift to get those reports done, get those inventories and those calculations, do the data collection. And the data, those are not data pathways that are naturally built into existing corporate infrastructure, right? You have to build that from scratch.
The challenge, I think, I'm sure anybody's listening to this will now be thinking, okay, yeah, Dominic, so you completely drunk the Kool-Aid, right? The flip of that is equally as important as what we were just saying, is that the destination, if you like, is our science-based envelope. We know what we can't break through in terms of, getting to dangerous tipping points. But the journey is so important about constant iteration and constant improvement. And if as a zig, then there's a zag to get it right. And it's probably always going to be like that, because there's always a new scientific breakthrough or a new technology or a new imperative that one needs to focus on, which we hadn't thought of before. A couple of examples: the rise of the data center has kind of put a whole new angle on the kind of scope 2 interaction between commercial real estate assets and the grid, which kind of wasn't there 4 years ago and completely wasn't in the mindset of, when one was devising a scope 2. The rise of different economies, where China is at now on some of these things compared to where Europe or the US, let alone some other emerging economies, in terms of levels of sophistication of data management control, state-orientated governments versus much more liberal market-orientated governments, and how you balance that. And then other ones which are pretty revolutionary for what we could do with a product like this, which is obviously AI. I mean, the opportunity space to absolutely optimize across multiple data streams, when we've been doing this 10 years ago on, Excel or punching numbers in, to both look at past performance trajectories, look at future simulations is incredible. And the burden of work, I think, that will be lifted from people who have to kind of grind through those reports. Once we get this right, it'll suddenly be a lot quicker, a lot smarter, and something that the exec board will feel much more excited and comfortable about in terms of using and simulating and looking at particular investment portfolios. And even though it's going from de facto to de jure, it still has the feel of a kind of a startup. There's so much that needs to be built and done, and so much opportunity in the space. And that zig and zag is absolutely part of that, because this is just not a static context in which we have to do these things. So it's actually pretty exciting. And I'm always delighted when there's people, like when you sort of put out like a job posting or something, just the amount of TVs that we get is incredible. People in their career who want to apply it, or younger ones who kind of want to start there. And can just imagine, Alexia, when we used to talk about carbon accounting, and now it's kind of got a fizz to it. It's kind of cool. But,
I always joke that, we were just in our backwater with about 50 international experts for a very long time, where it was just everyone was sort of fighting amongst themselves and having conversations. And we did this initial standard and nobody was really paying attention. And I think over the last 5 years, that whole set of conversations has really come center stage in a way that I think is both really helpful and also illustrates just where some of the system doesn't work as well as it needs to. And clearly the proliferation of standards right now is a real challenge for companies that are trying to figure out where they go and how they engage. And, I hear a lot, but just for the avoidance of doubt, nobody thinks that voluntary action is enough. Voluntary action was never anybody's plan A, right? We were joking the other day that we're really kind of on plan D at this point with the voluntary action sort of landscape in the United States in particular. And sometimes I'm just like, how is it 2026? And we are still just struggling to get companies to even disclose mandatorily, right, their greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, we've made a lot of progress. And also, we are nowhere near having the institutional frameworks in many parts of the world and in very important parts of the world, like mine. I mean, really anywhere outside of Europe, honestly, to mobilize this transition at the speed or scale we need. So WBCSD, I know, has sort of waded full steam ahead into this standard setting space because it is so essential. You've been engaging in other standard setting development processes in addition to the greenhouse gas protocol, including the PACT program, which I'd love to hear a little bit more about, the Partnership for Carbon Transparency. And you've also authored recently an avoided emissions standard, which focuses on emissions that are avoided by use of low carbon products by other entities in other parts of the value chain that might not be captured inside of your greenhouse gas footprint, as I understand it. So talk a little bit about those two standards, why you chose to develop them, and how you see them kind of fitting back into the broader constellation of standards that we're working in. And then I'll come back to convergence after that, because I want to talk about that too.
No, I'd be delighted to. I appreciate you raising them. I mean, I've been in this game, just at WBCSD for 4.5 years, as you kindly mentioned. I was at the World Economic Forum before that. So my journey getting really into the carbon accounting is really in this last 4.5 years, which I feel has just sort of coincided with the explosion of interest from that de facto to de jure, but also from the LCA practitioner or whoever's been working on this, as they now have to turn up to the executive board and talk to the CFO or the chief risk officer, because the game has changed a bit because of that shift to de jure. So different kinds of corporate professional are demanding different kinds of answers. And that means that the greenhouse gas protocol itself has got to kind of grow up, shape up, and be able to respond to those kinds of pressures from the CFO's office, from the chief risk officer's office, and from those in the regulatory space. So it's kind of like getting match fit for, when you said kind of how long will it take for us to get a proper mandatory regime? Well, we've got illustrations and indications of that taking place now. And we realize that we really have to up our game. We really have to kind of use our language smartly. We've got to have decision useful data. You and I, maybe other people who watch us have done it sometimes. We're talking to a friend at a party or something, or a professional friend who's in another kind of part of the economy, and you're trying to explain kind of scopes or 15
or even what I
categories.
do
Go
for a
through it.
living.
Yeah. And it's kind of like almost stripping down, but bringing back that language, who absolutely directs it, not only in terms of the importance of tackling climate change, but how this can bring business value to your company, how this can reveal where you can get real wins in terms of operational efficiencies or where there's innovations. And historically, we've not been great at that transition of language, and that's really where we're at now. So that's part of WBCSD's agenda. And to that end, that's where the product carbon footprint stuff has emerged with the Partnership for Carbon Transparency and the kind of avoided emissions or consequential accounting of that work, which I'll be happy to chat about.
Yeah, before we move to that, I want to come back to something you just said, which is really, really important, which is that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol needs to undertake a process by which it both sort of grows up and becomes a more organized and regulatory-like organization that is responsive to the needs of CFOs and CEOs. Can you just talk a little more about what that means for folks who are not deep in the weeds on doing that translation exercise and why it's so important?
Sure, of course. So for 22 years, this curious project, which has been adopted by 97% of the S&P 500, had no MOU between those two organizations, WRI and WBC. It was kind of like a project. If you're in any .org, you know what these projects are like, right? So you have trust between individuals, and you get the money in from a budgetary process, and you hire some people and you do some stuff. Beautiful and amazing as that is, that completely doesn't stand up to the rigors of a jurisdiction like California, or dare I say China, or dare I say multiple other organizations like the European Commission, or you name it, who need to rely on a professionalized standard setting organ which has all of the checks and balances that one needs. So almost like kind of bought the product, but now need to have the baby grow up. And to grow up, that's where one has to kind of just, number one, accept that. And that's actually part of the victory, and it's not a threat. And number two, go through that process of change. And that's what we've been doing over these past 3 or 4 years. And so in simple institutional terms, I'm creating like a steering board to provide, advice of senior people. So Geraldine Matchett, who many of you might know, she was the CEO and the former CFO of DSM, the leading chemical company. She's on the boards of multiple large multinationals. So she chairs that steering group for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which you created. There's an amazing man called Ove Samad, who was the number 2 at UNFCCC forever. He's very, very thoughtful international bureaucrat, originally from Hyderabad in India, but he's seen all of the political processes. So that public-private element instilled into an advisory board, a steering committee that has then a number of leading figures from finance and business and NGOs. So that can provide rather than WRI or WBCSD saying anything, this is what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol needs to do, everyone. Like, we know, because we know this circuitry. You need to get from here to here. And they've done an amazing job and continue to do so. An independent standards board. I mean, it sounds obvious, and I've just said it, but like actually a board which has the authority from people who are drawn from regulatory spaces or the FRAGs of this world or other things, who know what a standard needs to do and know what a good standard looks like and the process of creating a good standard, to be able to say, yeah, that's a pretty good one, we can go with that, or no, that's not cooked enough, or you messed up the process, or whatever it might be. That ISB was another very important piece of governance. So these are two things that we put in the last couple of years, and they've been working really well, and the interest beyond those is phenomenal. So that's great. Also, like any kind of great organization, you need a leader, because this was 2 hosted organizations it's been a real privilege to kind of, co-chair that with my counterpart, Craig Hansen at WRI, and then to have global directors, if you like, on the executive side of it, Pankaj Bhatia, who I mentioned, and we had a lady called Maya Kutner, who we brought in from CDP to do that. But we didn't have one overall CEO. And in the world that we're in, you need someone who's an ambassador, who can deal with the geopolitics as well as the technical, who can look to the financing as well as the civil society. So, I'm delighted that with our friends from Egon Zehnder, we put out like a tender to find that person. And we found a great person in a chap called Tim Mohin, who's a partner at BCG. And then previous to that was the CEO of the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and long history in technology before that in some of the leading US brands. So he's taken on the reins, and thank you, Tim, to kind of be the executive face of this. And we really need that, because in the sort of circuitry that we have, where there's a number of these different organizations, if we can have just a top level talent group of principals, across the 4 or 5 of these things, and they will get together and be smart enough and experienced enough to say, okay, here's how this will work. So it's kind of the growth, if you like, of this bottom-up agenda into something more professionalized. And with that, then governments and other international bureaucrats, or those who are very, very specific about the regulatory space in the legal world, will get more confidence, and then more money flows in. And the very precious thing that we've got, which has emerged from all of those discussions and is gradually bringing a similar framework together around the world, in the world that we live in, has a better chance of embedding itself. So that's the sort of journey, if you like, from where we were in terms of institutional strengthening. And it's an ongoing journey. We're not there yet, but we're on a pathway. Before I forget, that another key alignment in that fabric was with the International Standards Organization, the ISO. So we launched a COP30 in Brazil just last year, after a year of discussion, to bring the kind of standards world for greenhouse gas accounting together with ISO. That's a very significant move. And I'd just like to congratulate all the folks from the ISO side, who have worked on that. So that's 174 countries, which is pretty significant now. So these are all, and to do that, you absolutely have to professionalize your own piece of kit to be able to play in that space. So that's sort of all part of that journey. If we didn't, I think this thing would have disintegrated and the market would have moved on. And, we've seen really cool expressions in the marketplace. So we need to move faster. We need to move smarter. So you can sort of read the room.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most exciting developments that I've seen just in the NGO standard setting space over the last few years, is this real desire to make sure that the kind of quasi-regulatory sort of informal governance and oversight systems that we've built in the nonprofit and civil society community are really evolving to behave in a more quasi-regulatory, sort of official regulatory capacity, with much clearer notice and comment rules, very clear and transparent governance systems, independent boards. We just went through this journey, as you know, in the carbon market with the establishment of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. Right. And it was a very similar set of issues where you had a bunch of different nonprofits that had stepped into the breach to set the rules in the absence of government regulation. And so I think this opportunity to start kind of weaving together this infrastructure that we've built and spent, decades refining, improving, continuing to iterate on as we get new and better science, new and better data, and our understanding of the issues continue to evolve into this more regulatory construct that will hopefully start developing and pushing some international alignment and coordination across all of these highly fragmented and balkanized systems that we've developed, I think is really exciting and also a little daunting, because there's a few nonprofits that are going to go away. And that's hard, I think, for people to wrap their heads around. And ideally, we do move into a much more regular, predictable, accessible, public, transparent process for deciding what these rules are. Because the lack of regular updates, the sort of schizophrenia in this space around, you can do one thing today, but you can't do it tomorrow because all of a sudden we've all changed our mind about what right looks like that has to stop. That is nothing will kill private investment faster than changing the rules and saying something you invested in you thought was good 2 years ago is now no longer good and is worthless, is just, I think, a really, really critically important part of the puzzle. And I want to weave this kind of back into the conversation we were having about this, the current proliferation of standards around these key issues and why they exist today. So coming back to product level accounting standards, and what your vision for sort of bringing the system into a more coherent whole looks like, particularly as an international organization that both spans a bunch of standards right now and plays a really important role in, I think, helping to facilitate that global dialogue around what right looks like and how we start thinking in a more rigorous way about what the system looks like and how it functions in the future.
I couldn't agree more with a couple of your points there. It's exciting, but it's also daunting. I've got to give credit to our friends at WRI, and from a WBCSD perspective, there'd be every incentive to kind of hang on to owning a kind of piece of kit like this and saying it's all about us. But in fact, trying to move this into a different kind of institutional framework and stepping back to allow ourselves to be like a critical friend of the thing is the way to go. And it's not an easy thing. I mean, people have put like many, many years into it, but you've got to evolve the system exactly as you just described. And some of the great initiatives that we had have come and gone or been absorbed into other things. Or if we're true to the vision that we have, we've got to realize when the phase that we've been working on, that's ended, and now we've got to do this next stage. Otherwise, we'll all just be in jostling for our own projects and our own bit of rent from wherever we get it from to do our things. And that's not the answer. It's so not the answer, but it feels good if you're kind of just got a narrow sort of mindset of, I want to be feeling I'm doing something in the space. But you can't have both, right? You can't have the big change and not then also make the change yourself with some of these institutions. That's the sort of journey that we're on. Now, you're right. I mean, the World Business Council for Sustainable, I think it's quite amazing because, I mean, it was born out of the Rio Earth Summit back in 92. It kind of arrived in 1995 where Maurice Strong and others said, you know what, we're going to need something where, progressive businesses can actually help to say, this is what kind of needs to happen, interact a little bit with the international community. Of course, the world is completely different now, but still the role of the business in the climate transition and in the emission reduction is key. I mean, nobody's, I think, going to dispute that in terms of the innovation, scale of value chain, amount of balance sheet or drag that can bring the markets into play. It's critical. And like any kind of tipping point, the sort of 15, 20% of the first movers who want to get into that space and have enough interest to help shape markets is super important then for the middle. So all of that is entirely true. And probably for WBCSD, if you have a normal distribution curve, we've probably got companies in the middle of the curve through to that right-hand side. That's our sort of space of players. And we're not kind of devising things in our offices. I mentioned where the greenhouse gas protocol came from a number of companies back in the 90s. So about 6 years ago or so, we had a number of companies, Unilever, Fujitsu, Dow, BASF, several others, who said, it's not just at the corporate level that we're going to need to figure out this climate thing. It's also at what we call the product level, like the things that we make. If I'm a chemical company, I make stuff and then I sell it to you and you turn it into shampoo or something. Or if I'm Unilever or Procter & Gamble or something, I would buy those things and make it into shampoo. But all the way along the value chain, we're making a product. And like it's a bit of a kind of a mess back in the day for the emissions from companies in their building, the energy that they get in and across their value chain, also quite messy at the product level. So product carbon footprints, PCFs, can we sort of systematize that? And that's where the Partnership for Carbon Transparency came from, PACT. And the key word in there is transparency. And quite quickly, driven by those needs for companies, it became a group of 60 or so, and all of their suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, up the value chain. Like I said, the representation that WBCSD has across the end-to-end value chain is pretty interesting. And a couple of things emerged pretty quickly is that when you tried it out with a kind of version 1 methodology of just being consistent about trying to measure what the carbon product footprint was up 2 or 3 tiers of the supply chain, a first result was that there was a 30% improvement, and that's just the average. So you can imagine like the variation across that average, a 30% improvement in the accuracy of upstream scope 3 reporting, which is huge because people were kind of assuming the wrong things with industry averages or such, to the extent where you could say, I've been focusing all my effort on that ingredient, but actually the one that's a really challenging one in terms of emissions is that ingredient. How useful is that? Or indeed for the suppliers, I can now identify a much lower emission product creating supplier I can go to than the one I was with before. That's activating a market, right? So on the one hand, that could be quite destructive, Schumpeterian. The lowest carbon suppliers survive and the highest ones die. Those who quite like the market, quite like that. Those who want to have interventions, brilliant, because now we have transparency comes into play. So maybe there are financing or other kinds of support that you can give for smaller tier 2, tier 3 companies to get better, so that the larger company will, all of those get revealed from the transparency in the supply chain. That was the first finding. The second finding, which is kind of where this has got super interesting, is that it is a multiplier effect. So, we have great people like Salesforce or SAP and many others who, through their own systems have a lot of kind of interaction with companies for customer relations management or many other things. And actually, you then don't need an organization like WBCSD to be trying to control things. You're creating a sort of pact compliant mechanism within some of those companies. So then the scalability becomes enormous, because if those types of companies then can do what I just described, the ecosystem gets huge. So the reach of pacts exploded with these kind of amazing kind of scalers. And then the third thing, which was super exciting and sometimes a little bit hard to get one's head around, is this, particularly for our community, this is not a hunt for a perfect product carbon footprint methodology. There will never be one. China might kind of come up with its own particular methodology. The US might come up with one. A steel association might come up with one, and so on and so on. It is kind of a fool's errand to try and create perfection over a methodology. Technologies and things change a lot of the time, all of that stuff. What is missing is the equivalent, like we have in the financial community, of a SWIFT for exchanging carbon product footprint data seamlessly across different countries. So like SWIFT, I put my money in Japanese yen and it comes out in US dollars at the other end. It's still the same value, but it's managed to convert it. And so the build of that infrastructure to be able to frictionlessly move carbon product related data around is where PACT is at. And that's an enormous unlock for things like CBAM or you name it. So, and that's all come from kind of, business input saying this is what we need. Last year, we had 4 million PCFs move across that data infrastructure, over 5,000 companies. And it can provide a fairly impartial underpin for all of the things we might want to do across that whole range of PCF work. Some people might want to have a carbon product footprint, which is basically to choose that supplier, like I was saying earlier. Others are very excited about trying to create financially assurable product carbon footprints, in which case you need a different kind of methodology, but you need the same data and you need the same data exchange. So that's what PACT is about. And it's growing like crazy, and it's a fantastic team. And if you just put in to any kind of search engine PACT, P-A-C-T, and put climate or something, then you'll kind of see all about it.
Yeah, and I think this question of translation, interoperability, and working to connect up what are right now quite siloed but highly interrelated accounting exercises, right? How do I think about the emissions associated with my products? And how do I think about the emissions associated with my business activities, production lines, scope 3 emissions, electricity consumption, all of that? I think how those two systems end up interfacing is going to be both really messy, but also incredibly important, because right now they don't talk to each other in any kind of coherent way. And getting that to align in light of the direction of regulation. So you noted CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe, of course. That is an area where we have a government that is imposing a carbon border tax functionally and is developing their own emissions calculation methodology for assessing what that tax should be, tied back to application of greenhouse gas pricing and emissions trading systems. And so we're in this interesting world right now where I think systems that used to operate relatively independently and in many instances on a voluntary basis are now no longer operating in those independent silos. And you have this really interesting mashup of voluntary and regulatory programs that are serving different functions, have different kind of outcomes desired. Well, actually, let me correct that. The end outcome is the same, which is to reduce emissions and price carbon. And so that through line, I think, is really important not to lose sight of, because we get so lost in the mechanics, but really thinking through, like, how are all these systems going to talk to each other? And how do we think about, from a global kind of emissions governance perspective, creating what is almost certainly going to be an infinitely more complicated, dynamic, and frankly, balkanized set of domestic regulatory circumstances as countries move to Paris Agreement implementation, get engaged with Article 6, pass their own domestic regulatory regimes. Like, What is your thinking just about how do we connect all these dots and start thinking in a more organized way about making sure these systems can talk to each other? I love this idea of a Swift code and a translation capability. What would sort of scaling that up and pulling that out to other systems and applications look like?
For anybody who's contemplating this as a career, it's the most amazing space to try
Never
and figure
worry
stuff
about
out.
job security. That's for sure.
So there's a couple of things, I think, at least if I can say so from maybe my own personal perspective. But number one, nobody is trying to build global socialism. So there's no desire, at least from this side of the call, of some kind of massive top-down regulated GOS plan where everybody's filing their number, because that just opens itself up to opaqueness and gamification and absolutely stifles innovation, because we absolutely have to have something that does all the things that we need in terms of not smashing up our precious global public good, which is the climate, knowing that we have a certain kind of a threshold we've got to keep ourselves in, but we've got to optimize to drive business kind of innovation within it, rather than, throw a cold bucket of water on that and just swamp everybody with reg, because that doesn't work. So that's the sort of beauty of the space. So yeah, there are clear pricing signals attached to that, but that's where the transparency thing is super cool. At the same time, to help us with all of that complexity, we've got such a fast changing space in terms of data and connectivity and speed of compute and ability to simulate. Because our mind, you set it out perfectly, Alexia, but it's so complicated that most people go, oh my God, where do I start? So the ability to gamify and simulate and look at different options moving forward compared to different pieces of the system you might want to optimize, a clear and consistent carbon price here, a different kind of policy, perhaps for an incentive for a heat pump there, border tax adjustments. You can start to play with all of that and see what's going to work. But you need the data right at the heart of it, and you need the transparency. So that's the Swift bit that comes into play, because there will always be different methodologies. We're not going to have a common one size fits all, but we need to be able to translate like a currency converter. I mean, look how much struggle and strife there is around the euro. Some people like it, some people don't like it. We're never going to have a global currency, but we can certainly have a global currency converter, and we can have things like Swift that helps us move the currency around. Bingo for what we're needing to try and achieve in this space. We've got the data and the architecture to be able to do it. So we allow for innovation, we allow for different approaches to it, but we keep ourselves within the public good barrier of what we must preserve, because otherwise it's just ridiculous. So it's an optimization within constraints thing, rather than a search for top-down reg thing, would be my kind of take on it. And that is why, just to add even more kind of twists and turns to the story, and you mentioned it earlier and you were very kind, I'd just like to draw a bit of attention to it, is we've kind of brought another thing into the mix, which on the outside of the US world we call avoided emissions. You might kind of refer to it a little bit more as kind of intervention or consequential accounting. And this very much relates to that innovation agenda. And let me just quickly explain why. For a business who's thinking, yeah, okay, I can see this, that, number one, I'm going to have reg coming my way, or I'm going to have more of this transparency, which is going to expose my heavy carbon activities. I should shift my business model to be reg ready into something that's cleaner and smarter and whatever. Or I might smell innovation. I might smell opportunity. I might smell kind of a competitive edge in kit or product or whatever in terms of the electrification of the economy, whatever it might be. But it's really hard for me to be able to convince the investor community about that. I mean, I might not have enough balance sheet. Even if I'm a really large company, I might not have enough balance sheet. So how can I talk to somebody in the investment community that says, if I carry on at the moment, that's my emissions. If I switch to these new business models, I'm going to be here. And that delta is the avoided emissions I'm going to have over the next, say, 10 years or 2 investment cycles. And that's a chunk of emissions out the atmosphere. And if this product really takes off, it could be even bigger. There was no consistent guidance for that. And there's no standardized approach for how I might measure it, which every kind of investor or whatever would go, okay, that's the way you would do it. So based again on a number of leading companies, particularly from Japan, Panasonic, Hitachi, Fujitsu were quite big on this, and a number of French companies, Veolia, and then Schneider Electric, and Schneider takes it to China. So it's interesting where this came from, all right? It didn't come from, if you like, sort of European Commission ideas on regulation. It got picked up quite quickly on the US side, but could we create a standardized guidance for how we would measure the impact if we switched our business model over the next 10 years? So that took about 2-3 years of work, and a lot of that was smoking out greenwash so that you couldn't, it gets a bit geeky, but if you did that, you couldn't net that back to your inventory. It had to be the forward-looking thing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's really just the application of what we do at an intervention or project level in the context of the carbon market applied to an enterprise level strategy. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah. Okay.
But getting people to kind of understand that and get behind it, that whole kind of, again, that build of a de facto kind of movement. And then we were lucky enough in 2023, when Japan had the G7 presidency, this thing was endorsed by the energy, climate, environment ministers, which gave it a lift-off, and then the investor community got behind it. So we're now standardizing the guidance for this avoided emissions, which will kind of click in as the forward-looking part to complement the inventory, which is the backward-looking bit. And that will really drive innovation.
Yeah.
You know, because it will give you confidence to, I could make a handbrake turn in my kind of business and produce a whole different product line. And the capital markets have a standardized approach to understanding what that implication is. And for those who are looking to invest in the low carbon alternative, they will come for it, hopefully with a lower cost of capital.
And just to underscore why this is so incredibly important, I will hear sometimes that people will say, oh, well, we don't want any avoided emissions accounting in the system anywhere. Like, we're too worried about it being able to be gamed. It's a forward-looking projection that you're never going to be able to verify against a counterfactual, version of reality that may or may not ever occur. And the challenge is that if you are, just as you say, looking forward and trying to change decisions about what kind of CapEx investment you're going to be making, what types of businesses you choose to develop, what types of activities you choose to further engage in as a company, that is the accounting exercise. Whether you're talking about progress towards a corporate target, whether you're talking about just trying to understand the difference between what I did last year and what I did next year, and understanding what I might do next year in light of, all of these different options. And so I guess just a plug for the role and importance of standardizing and also having a really robust and rigorous conversation about how do you do that avoided emissions projection well? How do you do it in a way that is transparent, based on sound methodologies, and avoids, to the point you just made, the real potential for greenwashing, for inflation, for, I was going to do this, and now I'm saying I'm going to do this, but I really was never going to do this. That is the heart and soul of impact accounting, and it is very difficult. It is also essential. It is not an optional part of really thinking through a comprehensive measurement and oversight framework for corporate climate action or national climate action. Frankly, we have the same issue in the context of nationally determined contributions.
Yeah.
This conversation, I think, is a really important one for us to continue to have as a community. And I'm grateful that you guys have been doing the work to think through that translation to the enterprise and corporate level, because it really does matter. And particularly for companies that have high CapEx investments and multi-decadal planning horizons, helping them do that look ahead and figure out, there actually is a market to reward me for doing something that costs a lot more today, but is going to have significant emission reduction impacts in the future or in other parts of the economy. Like, we have to get that incentive structure right, because if we don't, we're just not going to get the money flowing into the things today that we need it to, that do cost more, but we know are essential to the low carbon economy transition. So just my little rant on why the work you guys are doing is so important, and the critical role it plays.
I appreciate that. So it's like the innovation side of this agenda. If we want people to kind of switch and move fast, where's the incentive and the capital going to come from to do it? And where's the standardized approach to figure that out? For those who kind of maybe a bit more in the public policy side and less on the company side, there's a really good analog from public health. So how do we think in the climate kind of community, those who do this amazingly important work in public health, figure out the implications of putting a tax on alcohol or a tax on sugar, or look at the health benefits of introducing a particular drug? That's a forward-looking projection against a baseline and trying to work out like a public good, an economic benefit. Very similar approaches. So these aren't kind of random methodologies, if you like, that have just been pulled off of the shelf. These are quite serious approaches, which many other professions have used when they're looking at ways that they can shift society, if you like, moving forward. So for those who've got like a public good, public policy angle to their mindset, that's part of, that's in the DNA of what that avoided emissions kind of agenda is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dominic, I've kept you quite late in the evening. Thank you so much for joining me today and for this excellent conversation and all the work that you are doing. And thank you especially for all the work you've done personally to help move GHGP into this next really critically important phase. I know it's been a labor of love.
There was dark hair when I joined.
Yeah. I always like to close with asking people, what are you excited about? What's getting you out of bed in the morning and keeping you coming back to work on this incredibly complex and challenging set of issues?
Yeah, so it's quite easy, isn't it? I think in this sort of phase of the journey that one could get a bit kind of, gloomy and thinking, is it all worth it? And where's the world going? And this, that, and the other. I'm kind of not quite like that. My wife and I, we've got a 19-year-old lad. He's now in his second year at university. He's very into kind of China and Chinese politics and international relations. And he sees the world very much in terms of that new chessboard of innovation and change. And yet a lot of these challenges, but there isn't that kind of like, well, it's all gone to hell in a handbasket mindset. It's just a different world from how we grew up. And the world that he's talking about isn't necessarily a kind of Scandinavian version of international organizations. It is much more how Mark Carney described the chessboard.
Yeah.
But in that, there's a load of innovation space. And I really get excited about all the innovation. I'm super hyped by the possibility of applying optimizations from physical AI, all of the kind of engineering and chemical and stuff in operations and plants to very, very quickly kind of optimize what we could do across a value chain and create a portfolio of different investments, which absolutely show the return of investment to each of those participating members. That will just kind of completely reduce the number of workshops and meetings and things that we have to do and turn it into product that a executive board or others can do. So I think we're on the cusp as a community. If we want to embrace the sort of changes that the world is creating for us and technology is offering for us, if we want to lean into that, I think we've got an amazing opportunity to do it. If we feel that actually all of these changes are bad and we're losing that kind of fabric of international cooperation and, nobody's understanding it anymore, then we won't be able to seize the moment. I have a great sort of quote I always keep in mind. It was from a British politician back in the day. And she said that the art of leadership is to turn a corner into a curve. And I love that because we might feel like we're hitting a corner and getting a bit of a dead end, but actually there's all of the opportunity here to turn it into a curve and a slingshot to do what we need to do. So that's what kind of keeps me going.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for the time, for the insight, for the work. Looking forward to continued conversations and appreciate you joining me today.
Well, thank you, Alexia, and thanks for all the great work that you're doing and the chance to have a chat with you on this podcast has been a delight.
That's a wrap on this special episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to follow or subscribe and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends or colleagues. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, take good care and keep up the fight.